Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next The Dawn of Yangchen chapter analysis video. This one's going to be for chapter 20, A Meeting of Minds. So this is the chapter where we get the meeting between Yangchen and Zongdu Chaisi, the Zongdu of Zongdu. So we've been waiting for this meeting for quite a while, and this is ultimately a very memorable, it's a very important chapter. Perhaps not necessarily just because of its impact on this book, but also because I think Chaisi is going to more be the focus in the next book, and it's clear some stuff that is set up here will have to come back to it, otherwise it will just be left unresolved. So there's a few interesting parts of this chapter that, remember this one later on, because there's a few details that we will definitely have to explore when a certain big reveal happens within the story. So definitely, I think Chaisi is a much more interesting character than Henshi in terms of the main Zongdus of this book. So let's jump in here. So we start off with Yangchen just being, quite happy with what happened, dropping Kavik off. His squeal of shock was worth the trip alone, when she launched him into the water, of course. She quickly arrives on Zongdu. There's a whole procession laid out for her, people conducting the crowd to be really, really loud. And it's very much the typical Avatar ceremony thing. Everyone happy to see her, especially because she's got a bunch of other air nomads kind of with her in her group. It's a whole thing like the parade from before, as she makes her way up to Zongdu Chaisi's house. The main thing here is just that they note that the Zongdu's residence was extremely plain compared with some of the gilded gates they saw on their way up. So they do note this about this character, that despite being basically a very wealthy and powerful woman, she seems to dress plainly, have a rather plain house. What's the deal here? Because you'd think it would maybe be the exact opposite based on sort of how the other Shang merchants have been presented, but she seems a lot more down to earth in some ways. But you'll see the different facets of her character as we go through here. So she arrives here, she goes into the kind of meeting room here, and while she waits for the Zongdu to arrive, she looks through the selection of books here to get a sense for who she's about to meet here. The books, will potentially indicate her host personality. So the first book up is The Pearls of Lahima. She already knew these essays by heart, one of the many attempts over the generations to interpret the teachings of her people's most legendary guru. So that makes sense. At this point, Yangchen has read everything about Lahima. She knows him quite well. That's fine. Next up, we have Huilu's 10 chapters on celestial circles and other artful mathematics. She'd read those too, though had it been her or another avatar. So there's a little bit of that kind of memory of the past avatar. She doesn't quite remember did I read that or did I just remember a past avatar remembering that. The treatise explained how to calculate the unending ratio between a circle's outside and its width using the ever narrowing straight-sided shapes. The Flame in the Mind, Oscillations and Harmonies, an old popular layman's compilation of techniques to assist in meditation from across the four nations. It described the incense and singing bowls of the air nomads, the flickering focus candles of the fire sages, the beat of the water tribe's drums, the wire brushes used in the earth kingdom to lightly strike the limbs and unlock chi paths. There was a common interest across the world in losing oneself with the help of light and sounds and the senses. Yangchen didn't recognize the thin slip of a volume lying flat and crooked by itself as well worn as a reference manual, the complete works of Shoken. Whoever this Shoken person was, they hadn't had a very long career, or perhaps they were just very concise. So this is Yangchen's first time coming across Shoken. At this point, she has not read any of his work, though we know from the Kyoshi novels, she goes on to be a noted reader of Shoken. I think they described it more that she read Lahima, but also read his opposition, which is Shoken. So this is a little bit of the origin story here about how she comes across Shoken through Zongdu Chaisi here. So at this point, Chaisi arrives in, and again it's noted, a short woman who kept her hair and clothes plain. It's also noted she was only a little older than Henshi, somewhere around 30. Henshi obviously being described as being around 25, so, still relatively young in the grand scheme of things. To Yangchen's surprise, Chaisi was about 7 months pregnant. None of the reports she'd read about her had mentioned the detail. So that's quite an interesting point there, because obviously that's there for a reason. And because, like I said, the character doesn't really appear in many scenes in the rest of this book, in the sense that the plot is more about Henshi and what he's up to, it feels like that is something we're going to have to come back to, and the significance of that in some way. Obviously the timing seems in a way perfect for, like, we come back in book 2 and she's given birth or something like that. But, it's an interesting detail to really heavily note the second you're introduced to a character. So, interesting. So, Yangchen congratulates her, of course. They begin to get down to business. They don't really know what to talk about at first, but Yangchen mentions the books of, like, we have similar tastes, though I haven't read any Shokan yet. So, Chaisi goes into this a little bit. Oh, but you must. He posits human beings are but surfaces, points of contact that don't exist unless we interact with others and the world around us. The only space in which a road and a wheel become relevant is the infinitely thin, ever-changing stripe where they touch. Together the cart rolls. Negation of the self, Yangchen said, a very air nomad concept. And they go into the idea, like he was a contemporary of your Guru Lahima, though he can be quite drama-prone in his phrasing. To possess a mind, destroy it first, sounds like a harsher version of empty and become wind. No, it does. What nation is he from? Shokan, unknown, like me. And this is where the conversation shifts for a little bit into this idea of, where's Chaisi from? Where's Chaisi from? And she notes that, like, everyone thinks I'm Fire Nation, you think I'm Fire Nation, but technically, no. That's a matter of maps more than blood. I'm not really Fire Nation, not traceably so. I grew up on a small island in the South Mose, that's the Mose Sea. The daughter of shellfish divers, no benders of any sort in the family, no clan traditions to uphold. My own ancestry remains a mystery to me, which is sad, I suppose, but common enough for those who come from the in-between places. So she's highlighting here that she's not from a fire island. She's from an island that is sort of separate enough from the grouping of the fire islands, and is not so close to the Earth Kingdom. It's somewhere in the middle. There's an island that matches that description. It's sort of like Natsuo Island from the RPG game. I don't think it necessarily has to be Natsuo Island, but that is just noted as being an unclaimed island in between. Whereas it's a sort of situation where, like, is she saying here that the island that she is from is technically a Fire Nation island, but her ancestry doesn't really match that? Or, just a clarification on the island is a bit unclear. But I think you get the sense for, like, it's not one of the really obvious ones that you can just associate as being one of those fire islands. But still, interesting stuff. The fact that she knows that off the top of her head highlights that she's obviously looked into her history to be able to know that she effectively has no, like, notable stuff in her family history. And that also kind of, in a way, links into the fact that, she's pregnant, she's about to give birth, and it's kind of like, who's the father? Is she trying to create sort of a lineage for herself, or what? What's going on here? Then we sort of get into the idea of, like, you've risen to great heights. I know the Water Tribe Chief and the Earth King envy John Dury as the jewel of the Shang system. So again, highlighting that she's probably the best leader of the bunch. But that, there's opportunities here, but, business is what is the focus. And because of that, not everyone has opportunities. And so this is Yangchen getting down to proper business here of wanting to improve things for the kind of common folk in each of these Shang cities. And we cover a few things here as they basically, go over the idea of like, you don't need to go over the full story. Sadao told me what happened in Bin They go back and forth a little bit, but they effectively get to the idea that, it can be done. Like, what you want to do, it can be done. And she surprises Yangchen by this, and it's like, it can be done. We can make the city a fairer, more balanced place. And she's kind of like, wait. Are you talking about Bin or John Dury? And she's like, yeah, both. As well as Port Tugok and Taku as well. Provided we're patient. And she goes over the idea of like, the Shangs of this island will do what I say, but I don't have much influence overseas. And old curmudgeons like Tain have to be talked to in a certain manner. I heard you mention the reforms in Omashu as a template. I've looked at them too. I agree. Something can be done here. We can speed this up. So they go over a few topics here. Like, she's kind of like, whoa, you're very different than Henshi here in terms of your approach. And she's just like, Henshi's an empty set of robes who only got his position because he looks good in front of a crowd. Now we're in league. We can, do this together. And Yangchen's sort of buying into what she's being told here and is like, yeah, this is going to go great. It'll all work out fantastically. And then she suddenly realizes, oh, I'm being like kind of given exactly what I want here. I'm just being kind of led astray here. That she has to get back down to sort of reality. Like it's one thing to get sort of like an agreement here, and it's what she wants. But they have to get then to the actual reality of figuring this out. And that's what happens here of like, okay, they can either choose to do this and talk about the realities of how they get this done as soon as possible, or she asked the question effectively, how long do you see these reforms like taking? And she's just like, a couple of years, as long as they need to, but it's a big project. It will probably take years. And Yangchen's like, if that's the case, I might end up having to work with one of your successors. And I don't know if they'd be as capable as you. Might there be a plan or a loophole to keep you on as Zongdu for longer? And Chaisi is kind of like, no. This is one of the unbreakable rules of my position. We have to do as much as we can with the time that we're given. And Yangchen fully agrees with this because, again, we have the comparison from before of the Avatar is a similar role to a Zongdu of a Shang city and vice versa. So Yangchen can agree with the general idea of she gets a lifetime in the role of Avatar to do as much good as she can, in the same way that a Zongdu gets 10-ish years. They never, I think, clarify exactly how long it is, but it seems to be something along those lines of you get 10-15 years in the role and then you move on. So they kind of move on. They'd have a break in the conversation here so we can have a break in the middle of the chapter. They go walking outside at this point, so that's quite good. And this is where we get the idea of Chaisi begins to open up a little bit more, and I suppose reveal more of the other side to herself right now. Where we're okay, she's manipulating Yangchen to a certain degree of agreeing with her, kind of satiating Yangchen to a degree by saying yeah, we'll do it. It'll just take a very long time. And Yangchen's worried about that just because the idea is that if they take it slow enough in trying to go ahead with it, that it will just, evaporate into nothing. And she actually wants something to happen here. But then the reality gets brought up here of just I have a piece of advice for you, Avatar. Be careful what you say around people you haven't vetted. To wit, my servant is a spy for the Fire Lord. And Yangchen's kind of why are you just telling me that? And then, if you know that, why are you letting him be your servant? And she's just yeah, I'm sure he's one. Fire Lord Gonryu enjoys the revenue I bring him in, but he has no desire to see any particular Zongdu linger. If he believed I meant to stay in power longer than my allotted term, there would be a great deal of trouble. So there we learn the name of the Fire Lord of this era. That is Fire Lord Gonryu, Gonryu. So with that, we have pretty much the lineup of world leaders, because like we will there's a lot of characters if you want to cover all the leaders of the air nomads, but effectively here's like the three key people in the world, and then the air nomads are respected enough that most people just let them do what they want because they're not changing things too much. So interesting stuff. Yangchen has a funny line here where she says, like, I'm sorry, I can't imagine what it would be like to live your life being spied upon. Where she's talked about this, like, to Kavik before, about, like, she knows exactly what this is like, but I could teach you a great many things about the experience. For now, the man is a useful instrument to make sure Firelord Ganryu hears what I want him to hear. Once that's no longer true, I'll dispose of him. And Yangchen is just like, what do you mean by that? I mean, I will make him go away so completely that his own masters will wonder if he ever existed in the first place. People will take as many liberties with you as you let them, Avatar. I could teach you how to deal with such offenses appropriately. And Yangchen is like super taken aback with this like really, really sudden turn from Chaisi, who's been reasonable up to now, but she's sort of aware that she's being like subtly like manipulated and so on, but it's going okay. And then all of a sudden this rather cruel side to her begins to come out here. And Chaisi brings up at this point what happened back in Bin and the parade, and the fact that stuff was thrown at Yangchen. You know, Boma got hit, Yangchen nearly did, and she's kind of like, that was disgraceful, the way Henshi did nothing to the perpetrators. If it were me, I'd have nailed their hands to their skulls so they could beg your forgiveness in the proper pose. And with the appropriate level of enthusiasm, one can easily survive such a punishment. So this really cruel thing of like, okay, some sort of punishment, like maybe, but it's probably not even the right thing to do given how the people feel in Bin and she wants to nail their hands to their heads and like force them to bow before Yangchen. Like, okay, big change of character here. What's happening here? And Yangchen has to get serious and is just like, you will refrain from making awful jests in my presence. And this is more or less what brings things to an end here. I've offended you. I thought a leader in your position might be receptive to discussing various strategies. Of course, my words were all hypothetical. That's what Chaisi says. So they should end the visit now. So after this, as they go to leave, Chaisi does give Yangchen the works of Shoken. So the book about Shoken is given to her. And interestingly, she says, in my childhood village, it was our custom to give honored visitors a gift of personal value upon their departure. The practice ensures a link between the host's past and the guest's future. I see you as a great avatar in the making, and I wish to be of one mind with you. And then Yangchen notes, she values unanimity in the truest sense of the word. So she takes the book and more or less goes. But there's one final thing that Chaisi has to say to Yangchen before she goes. So she's like, one more thing. I have a message for you that came to me by mistake. And she's kind of like, how did you get this? I chanced upon an injured messenger hawk on the hillside. I didn't mean to read it, but I didn't know it was for the Avatar's eyes only. And it's like, it's from Duke Zolian of the Sauwan clan. I'm sorry to have read your correspondence, and I didn't realize it was for the Avatar's eyes only. It sounds like things have taken a turn for the worse in Ma'inka since your last visit. I've never heard the Duke use such desperate language before. Those poor children, you can't imagine how my heart goes out to them. I assume you'll want to make haste for Ma'inka immediately. Each passing moment spent here could mean another life lost. Chaisi smiled faintly into the breeze, and that is one thing we cannot abide now, isn't it? And Yangchen is furious at this, because at this point she is really like annoyed at the way Chaisi's kind of like handling this situation, like just the casual reveals of like this kind of cruel edge that she has, then basically realizing like you intercepted a hawk from me, because again she basically controls messenger hawks, and it was mentioned before by Henshi that she doesn't do correspondence by hawk. If you want to talk to her, you have to go to her in person, but she has no problem just intercepting the hawks from the skies around her kind of area. So this is a very interesting one to get, because obviously I guess the idea is she's had this for a little bit, and realizing what's happening here has just suddenly put this on Yangchen, who otherwise I guess was going to orchestrate a big plan with the unanimity, going up against the Shangs, potentially wanting to like initiate some of this stuff straight away. But now she's created a bit of time for herself, because this is something Yangchen has to deal with immediately, because this is like, if you've been paying attention, I think this was referenced in the book already, but if you read the Kyoshi novels, you know what this incident is. The phoenix eels on Mainka Island. That's what Karuk ultimately had to deal with. And here's this idea that they're already telling you that Yangchen dealt with this issue before, and now something's gone wrong again. This is quite serious, so she has to go. And as we'll shortly find out, she immediately goes. Like, this is such a big incident for her. She has to go straight away, and so won't be able to immediately meet up with like Kavik and the others. So they're going to be left sort of like waiting, kind of, do we act on our own or what? But Chaisi has played Yangchen here to give herself all this time and take control of the situation, when otherwise Yangchen had the kind of the leg up on them ultimately by spying, becoming aware of the weapon and stuff like this. This has reversed it completely, and we'll come to sort of see with the few little chasey scenes that come, she is masterminding some of this. They hold back on, I suppose, the full extent of that, which makes her more of a mysterious character in terms of like, she seems really intelligent, really aware of what's going on, but just how much of this is in play. Obviously, it's one thing that like she has control of the unanimity at this point. That's interesting by itself. This thing that has been brought to fruition by some of the Zongdus before this generation, she has brought it the final step of the way. And now what's happening? But it's also weird, given that she specifically notes that she, at least to Yangchen, is saying that like, no, it's an unbreakable rule. We stay as for our term and then leave. And when she says that, she touches her stomach, like, you know, she's pregnant. So she seems to want to focus on her family going forward. And in a way, like some of the other Zongdus, she's fine with having her 10-ish years in power and then having a relaxing life. But that runs counter to what seems like some longer forged plans going ahead. So what's the situation here? And especially her, who talks about the whole idea of like her like lineage ahead of time is before her is nothing. Like she doesn't know whether she should consider herself Fire Nation or Earth Kingdom, because she's from an island in between the two that's not really considered either. No benders in her family from before, and no obvious, like, not a huge amount of like culture that she kind of has to follow. One of the few things is that idea of like you give someone something important of value, an important guest when they arrive. That's why she gave Yangchen the book, and that seems to be one of the few things that is notable that she sort of remembers in a way, like from her past. And what's the significance of that? Plus, I suppose, like the idea that she is pregnant, and is there any significance to that going forward? Is it just meant to be a thing that for her family is going to be important, or what? Because it's interesting, like we don't see if she has like a husband, who the father of the child is, what's going on there. Obviously, if you've read the book, there's a few other things I probably like could talk about in this, but it is kind of fascinating ultimately the way that this back and forth goes. that this is, in my mind, so much more of an interesting conversation, an interesting back and forth between world leaders than the previous one with Yangchen in the room with all the Shang merchants, because they were just the sort of, in a way, like kind of almost like simple-minded Shang merchants who were like, oh yeah, let's make fun of the Avatar and say that she can't do anything, and then cower in fear when she mentions the Earth King. Chasey here seems like she's done stuff already to sort of, in a way, account for the fact that, say, like, the Fire Lord is already, like, spying on her, and she's comfortable with that. And she isn't going to particularly matter if Yangchen tries to bring the other world leaders into play. She's sort of aware of that and is already sort of pre-countered that in a way. That's what makes this so much more interesting, that this is sort of this like Long Feng Azula dynamic, but sort of slightly different, in that I don't think Henshi is quite as good as Long Feng, and maybe Chasey, as far as we're aware, maybe isn't as good as Azula, but it's something similar to that, of like they're both trying to play this game of politics. One is doing exceptionally, the other isn't doing much. So interesting stuff overall. But she, unlike say Henshi, who tries to lie to her, it does seem like Chasey, even though she lies to her about certain things, like, oh, like, I just happened to find an injured hawk, that happened to be your message, she's not exactly hiding the obvious, like, opposition, the obvious, like, cruelty that she's presenting to Yangchen. So it makes her a very, very interesting character. And again, this is from a character who, it does not seem to be like a physical threat, is not a bender, is, you know, heavily pregnant at this point. So this is all about what she implements and has done with her power. And that makes her very, very interesting. So in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on this chapter. What are your thoughts on Zongdu Chasey here, who we properly get to see in action for the first time? A lot of really cool references here, with like Lahima getting a few references. This is where Yangchen comes across Shoken for the first time. We get a few little quotes about that. But I will also say, again, more referencing the spoiler topic, which we'll get to eventually in the chapters, I do kind of feel like the other two books might be somewhat relevant. I don't think those two books are there to just be completely like random books. Like, here's 4 books, 2 of which you'll know as references, 2 of which are just there for flavor. I kind of have a feeling that at least one of the other 2 books might play into something interestingly. But if you know what I'm talking about, you probably know what I'm talking about there. But anyway, let me know what your thoughts are on this important chapter. But with that, we move into next chapter will mark the halfway point, just going past the halfway point of chapters with chapter 21. There's 41 chapters in the book, so we're basically there. This one is, it's not quite the halfway point of the book. We're a couple of pages off being the page count halfway point, but we're basically right there. So that has been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.